We're good.
All right. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our Lily Show and Tell series. My name is April Shepard. I am the past chair of Lily, and I'm also a member of the Lily Web Committee. If you're not familiar with Lily or what are, it stands for Lifelong Information Literacy, and we are an all-volunteer group of librarian and information professionals who work to promote lifelong information literacy. If you want to learn more about Lily, join Lily, or if you want to host your own show and tell series, I just put my email into the chat. Feel free to email me anytime. Before we begin, I do have two quick housekeeping items. One, you probably saw just a minute ago that the session is being recorded. We will try to get the recording sent out within a week, usually faster, but give us a week. And then as Michelle, our presenter, talks, feel free to put your questions into the chat. I'm going to make a note of all the questions that come through, and then we'll get to the questions at the end. Today's presentation is on using archival materials in history courses and will discuss archival collections in a college setting and how to incorporate primary sources into courses based on specific assignments as designated by course instructors. I'm personally am very excited about this one because I was interim head of archives for 2 years. I learned a lot about archives, so I'm really looking forward to this. Our presenter is Michelle Sanchez, and she is a reference librarian and archivist currently at Chaffey College. Michelle?
Thank you, April, very much. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's attending. Let me share my screen so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, yes, minimize this out of my way and slideshow. Okay, there's like you worked this morning. All right. So today's topic, like April said, we're going to be talking about using archival materials in history courses. So my name is Michelle Sanchez. I go by she, her, hers, and I am the reference librarian slash unofficial archivist at Chaffey College. We are a 2-year community college in Southern California. There we go. So I just want to start off with a land acknowledgement. Chaffey College currently sits on the unceded Tongva and Gabrieleño lands in Southern California, Inland Empire specifically. We are just below Mount Baldy. So if you're familiar with that area, that's where we're sitting. So what to expect with this particular presentation? I'll be talking about the importance of using archives in the classroom and how that can help benefit your students. And I will move on to showing specific implementation examples of what I did at Chaffey College with history courses. And just as a trigger warning, you will see with some of the slides some offensive and harmful language at the time when we are looking at these primary sources. And then finally, I'll wrap up with how to get instructors or faculty members at your institution to buy in to your endeavors. So I just want to start off with a poll from Slido. You can either use your phone, go ahead and use the QR code, or go to slido.com and enter in the number 609, oh, excuse me, 606-9902. So I just want to ask, does your workplace have an archives or not? And it doesn't matter where you're at, if it's an academic library, a corporate, school library, public library. I know we usually tend to see archives with mostly just academic and public libraries. But you never know. Sometimes I'm surprised with who has an archives or not. Okay, we're balancing it out a little bit. I'll just give it maybe you've got a couple more seconds. Oh, okay, shrinking a little. But it looks like for the most part that most of us, we do work at a place that has an archives with, oh, wow. It's just shrinking before my eyes with the no. Okay. But yeah, so most of us, we do have an archives at our workplace, regardless of what workplace you are at. And then for those of you who do have an archives, how is it utilized or who uses it? Who is your major clientele, so to speak? So again, feel free to take part in this poll because coming from an academic background, it's mostly going to be faculty members. personally, since we are a community college, sometimes we get people in the public, especially if it is people like, oh, my grandpa went to school here in the 50s. Like, do you have anything in the yearbooks, any photos of him? So we get a little bit of a balance between outside people and faculty members. Okay, administration. Yes. We do get administration occasionally. Okay, yeah, faculty seems to be the second top clientele. Students, yeah, I mean, yeah, students can come in. Um, for instance, I had one, bless their heart, they wanted to use just browse, casual browsing. I'm like, oh, I love your enthusiasm, but archives really isn't set up just for browsing. You do need like a research reason, so we know what to set aside for you. So that was pretty awkward. Okay, historical college data, yes, yeah. Oh, activist organizations, that's interesting. Professors, yeah, community. Oh yeah, artists, yes. I've had, I think, one artist request in my time here. Oh, cool. TV documentary or book creators. Yes, yes. Okay. So I'll call it there. So it does look like the majority of our clientele, excuse me, who come in to use our art to any archives are faculty members, followed by administration. It looks like researchers and students might be equal in terms of how many occurrences happen. And I'm looking at the reasons, yeah, historical data, artistic reasons, and activist reasons. So that's great. Thank you so much. It's really good to see how your archives are being used in comparison to ours at Chaffey. So moving on, how did I end up becoming the archivist? Because I will tell you, the archivist position here at Chaffey is not official. There was no job listing, there was no announcement. It just kind of landed in my lap. So when I went to library school, I originally was taking courses that focused very highly on archival content. And I initially did want to be an archivist properly. And I managed during my time in library school to get a position. It was a 1-year grant at the Huntington Library in San Marino, um, working on processing and organizing this one collection. You might know it if you've been rummaging around. It's the Grace Nicholson collection. It followed a East Coast socialite. She came out to the Pacific Northwest and did a lot of photography, focusing on the Native American groups up there, as well as purchasing handicrafts from them. And then she came down to Pasadena and was selling the artifacts there in her own shop. So that was a year-long grant. And I fell out of archival work after that. I ended up moving into academic environment, which was fine. I enjoy it as well. And then when I came here, my work in archives did not come up in the interview process, but it did come up when I was just casually talking to our coordinator, when she was getting to know me. And I said, oh, yes, I also happen to have archives work. And she said, oh, we have an archives. You're in charge of it now because the person you're replacing actually was kind of in charge of archives. She's gone, so now you're doing it. So I'm sitting there going, oh, okay. Just kind of awkwardly holding my new responsibility. But it honestly worked out. It's really great. I love it. I've been going through our collections, itemizing everything, getting finding aids up, and working with staff and faculty with their requests ever since. So in terms of using archives in class courses, there are some great things about doing this. The first thing is that you help give students a tangible interaction with the past because when you're observing a history class or if you teach a history class, you see the students and they're just kind of like zoning out, and all they think they have to do is, oh, I just need to memorize these people. I need to memorize this events, these dates, and I'll get an A on my test. And they really can't get engaged with the content that you're teaching. So if you are lucky enough to have access to archival materials that have relevance to the topics that you're teaching in your class, you could say, okay, look, here's an example of what happened in this time period when this person was alive. And the students can look at it and say, oh, okay, and they can get a better idea of what was going on in history at the time. Another great thing about incorporating archives into your courses is that you're teaching students how to evaluate evidence. especially with primary sources like photographs and letters, especially, and even manuscripts. That way the students can look at the materials either like on the screen or in their hands and make not assumptions, but conclusions about maybe historical claims that famous historians are making, and they can see like, oh, this is how this particular historian made this claim because they were looking at item A and B and they pulled evidence from there. Okay, I see where they got that conclusion. Or maybe they go to another historian and they say, well, why are they making this particular claim when this artifact, A and B says something totally opposite? How they get there, I'm going to challenge that. So that's another great reason to use archives in your class courses. And then another reason is that you're teaching students to research for relevant information. If these students are maybe working on a project or a paper and they're trying to put forth an idea or a claim in their assignment, okay, so what primary sources are out there that illustrate the point that you're making? So that just really helps them to go through the materials, find the proper resources and say, okay, I can use this particular source to back up my claim. So in terms of specific examples, the history courses that I was working with, this was last academic year. No, 2 academic years ago. I don't know what year it is anymore. Um, but the 2020, no, last academic year. I don't know what time it is, guys. Fall 2023 to spring 2024. And it was one history course each. In fall, I helped an instructor teaches History 70. This is our Chicano Histories course. Typically, this course talks about the historical relationship between Mexico and the US, and we go into all sorts of areas. So, Native American origins in Mexico, um, colonialism, independence, nation building, Mexican American War, all that stuff up to the present day, especially now that we have talking about issues of border conflicts. And then the History 18 course, this is our US history course. It's typically the Reconstruction period to the present day. So with our first course that we're going to talk about, the Chicano history course, this got off the ground. I was still fairly new. This was my second year at Chaffey. I was still kind of getting acquainted with the collections that we had in archives. And I had kind of been reaching out a little bit to instructors. I wasn't quite sure of my footing at the time, but the Chicano history instructor did reach out, contacted me and said, oh, for this course or for this class that I want to bring into the library, I would like you to find primary sources from the archives to illustrate Chicano people's experiences in the US, mainly focusing on the citrus industry, if you happen to have that. So the process was the instructor came into my office. We talked about the class, what he expected or was hoping for to come out of the archives for the class. I took his list, his wish list. I went into our archives area. I pulled some stuff that I thought would be relevant. It was a mix of primary and secondary sources. And then the instructor came back on a different day after I contacted him saying, oh, look, I got some items that might be relevant for you. He came in, we sat down, we looked at the items that I had pulled, and I got his sign off on it. Great. And then I created a lesson around the objects that were okayed. So the main one that I used, this is a draft of a report that was later published. It was called the Mexican Project. It was written by Merton E. Hill in the 1920s. He was, I think, our first superintendent of the Chaffey district at the time. And this was all about an Americanization program of Mexican migrant workers. Um, from what I looked at from the draft and the published end product, it was teaching Mexican migrant workers, the proper quote unquote way of keeping house, keeping a budget, taking care of your children, especially with the children part. Hill had the claim that, oh, Mexican workers, they tend to have a high infant mortality rate. So we need to teach the women how to take proper care of their children so that they survive. The children, in turn, school age children, up into I think mid-teens, They would be taught basic arithmetic, penmanship, reading skills, and then the boys would go on to learn how to make furniture, and the girls would learn how to be, quote, house servants. I'm assuming these were housekeepers. And in the final draft, it wasn't in this particular primary source, but it was in his final published draft. Hill said that he wasn't trying to prove the inferiority of Mexican migrants. That was not his deal at all, he claimed. The point of the program was to give Mexican migrants the education that would help them move up in life. So that's what he was insisting this program was about. So specific examples from this particular draft, this was, it looked like it was typewritten on that very flimsy paper material. I think it's called onion paper is the proper term for it. But here we have some photos that were stuck down in the paper and as well as some text that was typewritten. So here we have an example of what's called the Chaffey Escuelita. It was a old bus, an old vehicle that was retrofitted to become a traveling classroom. So these would go out to the migrant camps out towards Ontario Airport, I believe, if you know that area, if you've ever flown into Ontario, if you're out of state, they would go to the camps. And in this case, the women would climb into the bus and have lessons on hygiene and childcare. Here we have a photo of a Christmas program. The caption for this was handwritten called Little Pete and Big Sister. So here, I'm assuming this is Little Pete, and we're assuming this is the big sister with kind of a scary looking Santa Claus patting the boy's head. Here's an expert that went along with the photo of the Christmas program, talking about the YWCA doing a Christmas program with the children at the migrant camp. And I just thought this particular phrase was interesting. The girls found that the house promptly filled with a courteous and appreciative Mexican audience, and that the performers were a consistent and talented group. So this just really allows the students who are looking at this primary source, okay, going by what Hill typed up in this draft or his report, what do you think were the feelings towards these Mexican migrants, to the children that they were being taught? You know, what was the sentiment towards them? What point of view are you getting? So just really getting the students to think about beyond the text. Another example here, we have a photograph called Christmas Party um, given by Chaffey Girl Scouts. Here we have a fairly large group, looking like it's the mothers with the children and the creepy Santa hiding in the back. And then I think what's telling here is this group of white people, maybe middle class. I probably wouldn't say upper class, but maybe middle class people coming to watch the program. I just think the whole composition of this photo is interesting. This particular excerpt does not go with this photo of the Christmas program. I just included it because you can definitely see the language going on in here, especially when they're talking about adjustment room and putting, you know, subnormals in this adjustment room. And they were really targeting kids who didn't speak English. Maybe they were hyper focused on something. To me, maybe these children, you know, were on ADHD. At least that's the impression I get, but of course we don't know that. And other children who were out of school working, so probably helping their parents, getting some income. And just further down, talking about how the principal says, oh, it's really hard to get really good teachers to work in these Mexican schools. It's just not a fun time. And also the pay is really bad. So it's really hard to get teachers who want to work with these students who sound like, at least to this audience, they're problem students. So again, just really presenting this material to the students in this history course and asking them to make any connections from this primary source and to what they're learning in the actual classroom proper with their Chicano history professor. And I think this is the last example before we move on to the next class. This particular section here is talking about the creation of a Bureau of Placement and Labor Investigation that would work with the county's Department of Education and what those duties would be. What I found stood out to me was the very last task. establish the closest possible cooperation with the County Department of Education in a continued study of the problems arising from the presence of so large a Mexican population. So I'm asking the students, okay, what does that particular sentence say to you? Um, Not just from a gut reaction, but also from what you learned with a professor in your regular classroom and what you've learned so far in your Chicano history class. What does that say about the attitudes, specifically maybe white, middle class, even male attitudes surrounding these migrant workers? And then here's probably the biggest example of upsetting language. This particular section here, the docile of Mexicans. So you can definitely see the viewpoint that was being held at the time in the 20s about Mexican migrant workers. It's not very great. Talking about how they're bringing up diseases, they're always sick, they live in really bad conditions, big families because of sexual intemperance, and they're spreading disease all over the place. And this is why we need to come in and teach them how to properly live. So again, just as I warned you at the beginning of this webinar, warning the students, just be aware of the language that's going to come up. This just reflects the time in which this primary source was written. Oh, I lied. One more example of visual examples from the draft here. We have a photograph of the baby clinic in the little mobile bus, Escuelita. Here in the back, it's kind of blurry, but you can see a baby sitting in a scale. We have a younger child sitting on, I don't want to call it an examination table, but the desk, we'll call it the desk. And here's a before and after sort of photo here. We have what's called camp before it was cleaned up. And I know for a fact, when I looked at the published book for this report, the caption was way different. It did not say camp before it was cleaned up. I think it said something along the lines of, oh, the people we are teaching, or something to that effect. But here you can see a picture of, looks like a mother with a bunch of children. We don't know if all her children or if they're children from another person. We can't tell from this photograph. And you can see in the back the homes. Again, we don't know, are these in the process of being built? Have they been up this whole time and they're deteriorating? Hill does not say that. He just says, oh, this is what the camp looked like before. And then the after photo here, we have a photo of the children in front of a really pretty flower bush. Hill asserts that this is the camp after cleanup. The flower garden does not make the contrast by picture very great. So what are you saying, Mr. Hill? Are you saying that this particular addition of a flower bush, it's not that much of an improvement? Like, what are you trying to say? So just really, I'm trying to teach the students in this history course, read between the lines, look between before and after photos if there are some. I would even say, I don't even think this is the same location, but again, we don't know. We weren't there. So we can just tell these students, okay, make your best conclusions going by the evidence that you have, along with the knowledge that you have learned in your history class. So complications and challenges that came up from this particular implementation was how fragile this material was. Like I said, it was like put in those old folders. I don't know how many of you remember these, but it was like those flimsy folders, and it had like the metal hinges that you would put your three punch hole papers in there, and you'd flatten it out. It was in one of those, and you know, like tissue paper, onion paper sort of material. So I could not have this being handed around to a whole class of, I think, at most 30 students. So how would I get the students to view this primary source safely? I actually worked with our library technician. She's awesome. She has a really good knowledge of archives as well. She said, why don't we scan the entire material and then tell the professor this can only be used for classroom purposes. Don't share it. Don't put it out there because copyright, accessibility, all that. And luckily, the instructor has worked in a library, in an archives before, so he knew what was going on. So there was no problem with that. Cross communications was another challenge that came up during the consultation period. I was under the impression that he wanted not only just primary sources, but secondary sources as well. And then when the class came in, it turned out like, oh, the instructor only wanted primary sources. Oh, okay. Lesson learned for next time. So the secondary sources talking about the citrus industry was not really needed or wanted for this particular class. And then finally, there were a lot less primary sources than I thought we'd have. Oops, sorry, my light went out. There we go. So that's one less primary source that I thought we had. The one that I just showed you concerning the draft about this report about Americanization, that was the only thing that fit his wish list. Um, so in this case, just because we are a community college, we are more focusing on the history of the college. It just so happened that we happened to have a primary source that fit our instructor's wish list, and it was written by the first superintendent of our district. It just happened to be that way. So in this case, the wish list for this particular faculty member, he would probably have been better off going to a local public library. I know there are at least two libraries out near us that have a really, really good archival collection talking about Mexican migrant workers' experiences, not just in the citrus industry, but just in general agricultural industries. So the next example class that I was implemented into was our U.S. history class from Reconstruction to the modern day. In this case, the instructor reached out to me and said, "Oh, I would really love to see if you have any primary sources, mainly photographs, in the college's history, because I have my students, instead of doing a paper, I'm going to have them do a digital public history presentation. And the students, they already have their topics selected, and I'll just let you know, and you can choose what items you have that best illustrate those topics." So I said, great. So the instructor came in, I talked to her about her assignment, went over what we did have, at least off the top of my head at the time, and she said, perfect, go ahead and look in your collection, see what you got. So I went to our archives again, just like with the Chicano history class, and this was a little bit easier. I was able to find a lot more photographs, especially from our student life collections, and pulled information or photographs that fit the topics of interest from the students. And she came back in, we reviewed the items pulled. She said, perfect, more of this, please. Great. So that was a lot easier. And I created a little PowerPoint um, presentation. I didn't include it here for just to be safe with the time. But it did show in that presentation for the class. I just gave the students a brief overview of what archives are, how they work, what to expect, how to handle our archival material safely. And then also, since it was a history class, this is how you cite archival materials using the Chicago manual style. So I'm just going to show you the top three um, subject areas that students wanted to do their project on. The first was women in education, and I fell in love with these photos when I was itemizing our collections. These are photographs from our aeronautics department in 1942. Of course, it was World War II, men were going off to war and leaving open these positions in the job areas, in the careers. So, of course, as we probably have learned in our youth, during our U.S. history class, women stepped up. They filled in the spaces that men left behind or left open. And I just thought this was a really good example of this. So these are just photos of women learning hands-on experience with our aeronautics department. And we have our professor here in these photos, kind of at the top and then at the bottom. Now, I think this topic had the most students invested in, fashion throughout the ages. And oh my gosh, so many to choose from in our collection. I was honestly overwhelmed trying to pick which ones that would best represent from each decade, or at least try to do that. Um, so this first example here, this is from the 60s. We had a beauty pageant, I think from the late 50s to mid 70s. It was the Miss Ontario International Airport contest. And this particular photograph shows the winner of this particular year. I wish I remembered which specific year it was, but just check out those dresses. Here is a photograph from the 50s. I thought this was perfect because it both showed men's and women's fashion here. I'm loving the skirt. And then this photo is from a club photo. I forget which club it is, but this was from the 30s. And you can definitely see just how fashion has changed throughout the years. And this was, I think, the most successful topic with the students because they connected to it so easily. They were going through it and said, "Oh, my grandma used to wear something like that," or "Oh, my mom used to have this hairstyle." So it was just really great to see the students personally connecting to these photographs, thanks to knowing what their family members used to wear back in the day. And just another example, here's a photo of men in the 40s. Like, wow, check out these trousers. They're like so high waist, but that's how it was at the time. And this one on the far right with these women, this was Associated Women's Body, I believe it used to be called. They had their own little meeting rooms of just these cute little cardigans and cute pearl necklaces. And then here's a photo from a dance in the 50s. And then finally, the last topic that we had a lot of interest from the students was BIPOC students in education. So Black, Indigenous, people of color. And, you know, in our history, um, basically it has been primarily white slash Caucasian students up until the 40s, and it started to include a little bit more people, mainly Asian or Asian Americans, Black, African American students. Kind of petered off again in the 50s, but then of course 60s onward, we had a more explosion of BIPOC students. So here we have a photograph of a young man in the 60s. These two girls down here, Asian or Asian American in the 40s. Off to the very far right, we have a club photograph. You can definitely see how it's picked up in diversity a little bit before it dropped off back into mainly white Caucasian students. Here we got somebody here, we got some people up here, maybe even down here. And then getting into the 90s, I believe this is an aeronautics or no, an automotive technology class. You can definitely see a lot more diversity there. Now, the complications and challenges for this particular implementation, again, material fragility. These photographs, you know, some of them, thankfully, not the whole thing was ripped apart, but like a little corner was ripped off, and we didn't have a lot of proper storage for them, like the little, not plastic slips, but those little slips for the photographs you can get in there, have it protected so the students can handle it. What we did is we managed to purchase a ton of new archival gloves. And especially since it was going to be a lot of students, especially with the fashion topic, and they wanted to look at all these photos, I said, okay, since there's so many of you, please break yourself up into smaller groups, designate one person to be the photograph handler. They can put on the gloves, and you guys can crowd around and just say, oh, can you please turn the photograph over and move on to the next one. So that way we don't run the risk of the photographs getting even more damage, whether by accidental tearing or having our little greasy fingerprints get all over them. Um, Another thing that popped up that was interesting was professed interest did not show up at the class. So what that means was the news that I got beforehand of students saying, oh, they're interested in this topic, this topic, this topic. By the time of the class, and I showed them the professed topics that they were interested in, they had either lost interest or those students didn't show up, or they maybe changed their mind as they saw the materials being presented. I don't know. There could have been a whole bunch of different factors. So that was kind of rough, having maybe a little bit of the items I have pulled for them ended up not being useful after all. So getting instructor buy-in. Typically I do email blasts like this example here that I just did at the beginning of this semester. I just make a flyer in Canva. Um, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just you already use a pre-made layout. And I looked at our photos that were already digitized in our collections, pop them in there for some visual interest, and then blast the email to both full-time and part-time faculty as well as staff talking about, hey, this is how you can use our archives. Did you know it's not just there sitting in a room? And also, I mentioned it to the history and ethnic studies professors. The history professors, they are not my liaison department, but I do run into them a lot, and I kind of whisper in their ear saying, hey, did you know you can use this for your class? And same with ethnic studies professors. That department is my liaison department, and I regularly bring it up whenever I meet them, if they express a little wish, saying, "Oh, I wish I had something to show for this class," like, "Hey, I can help you with that." So what also helped me was when I first started out, in my very first semester, along with fellow new faculty members, we all had to do mandatory new faculty orientation. And that's where I actually met the Chicano history professor. We both started at the same time. We made working relationships there during orientation. And that's why he reached out to me later on, a year later, saying, "Hey, I need your help using archives in my class." So that was great. It's like, yes, we're best friends now. We can totally have a great working relationship, bringing archives and history together. And then just word of mouth. Like I said, not only just me going up to professors and casually saying, "Hey, you can use this," other professors who have already worked with me spread the word to their colleagues. Um, so even just yesterday, I heard someone talking about it. I said, "Yes, yes, please do spread the good news." Also, what helped me was getting involved in our social media. We do have an Instagram. And when I figured, well, gosh, why don't I share what we have in our archives on Throwback Thursdays, if any of you take part in that for your institution as well? Just some examples. This was the very first photo I posted. This is our location, our old location where we're at now. It's not our original, but our original location. This is our library in 1921. That got 43 likes. It's not the highest liked photo on our profile since the beginning of time, but it's one of the higher ups one. It's definitely high up there and like top 5 liked. And an example I did just last month for Black History Month, like what do we have here that reflects Black excellence, all that fun stuff. We actually had Marian Anderson. She was a contralto back in the 40s. She went on to become the first African American singer at the Met in New York. Apparently in 1945, she came down and did a performance and a meet and greet. So I thought, oh, that'd be really cool. And that got 20 likes. So it's really great just so people see our stuff on our Instagram profile and say, "Oh, I want to get in touch." And how can I use archives in my class? Or even if it's just outside community members, like, "Oh, maybe they have something related to my family when they went to school to Chaffey back in the day." So results, oops, too far. Results. From all of my efforts, huge increase in using archives from faculty just in this semester alone. So spring 2025, I had a history instructor come in. She was looking for photographs of women in sports teams as far back as I could find in our collections and in leadership positions, so like student body positions. And this was in preparation for a Women's History Month panel that we actually had just yesterday. It went great. It was perfect. And she actually did a shout out to the audience saying, "Oh, if you need archival help, if you need to do research, contact Michelle. She's right here on the panel. Let her know." I'm also working with an ethnic studies instructor. This is an ongoing project. They're looking for instances in our school newspapers, our student newspapers, talking about the emergence and development of ethnic studies courses, mainly focusing on the late 60s to the 70s. And they're also looking at our schedule of classes as well and catalogs. And then, funnily enough, a ceramics instructor of all people contacted me. She basically wants her students just to know, in general, our history. So she came in with a sample viewing of photos from our early history from the late 19th century to early 20th century, as well as some secondary sources that maybe people have written about our history. And she plans to have students from her class to come in later on this month, look at more examples of that, and even incorporate maybe some primary sources like photographs, get scans of them to put into their art project. So that'll be interesting. I can't wait to see how that goes. Oops. Okay, now we can do the closing slide. So thank you so much for attending my little talk. If you have any questions or anything like that, you can always contact me at michelle.sanchez@chaffey.edu. If you're interested in seeing our archives, we do have a LibGuides. Um, it includes a lot of finding aids. It's not a complete project. I'm still working on that, but we have finding aids there. We have, policies, all that fun stuff. And if you want to look at our Instagram, you can go to Chaffey College Library. It's all just one word, and you can see what we've posted so far concerning our Throwback Thursdays with archives. Yeah. So So thank you very much.
Thank you. This was very good. I have lots of questions. Um, so are you ready?
I am.
All right. Um, so how much time did you spend, you think, for each class, like pulling the resources and then developing the lesson to go with it?
Oh, Lord. Definitely more than an hour. Because at the time, I was not as familiar with our collections as we were now. So still fairly new. So I would say maybe an 45 minutes to an hour browsing, looking for stuff. And then maybe half hour to an hour putting together the presentations.
Okay.
So yeah, so maybe about 2.5 hours to be generous. It took me to prepare for these classes.
So you're not an overthinker like I am.
Well, I can overthink at times, but I just like control yourself. Like,
So you mentioned a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to expand on this. You talked about the onion paper, you talked about, making the students wear the archival gloves. So in addition to the lesson that you were doing, did you also talk about why we archive, why we have an archive, and then the importance of the preservation of materials?
absolutely. That was something that I did talk to about the students. I even asked them, I think in the American history class, I did a word cloud to start out with. I said, why do you think we have archives? And most of them hit the nail on the head. It's like, okay, we need to preserve our history. It's important to remember where we came from in order to understand where we're going now. But I did also expand upon like, oh yeah, this is why we save our stuff and preserve our stuff. We don't do it for fun. I mean, we could, but for the most part, it's just really to preserve what came before us, understand the viewpoints of what was going on back then, so we can understand where we're going and how we got to where we are at now.
And how big are the classes, and how do you do class management given the fragility of the materials?
So typically our classes, I would say they range between 25 to 30 students a class. And I do let them know ahead of time before I let them loose on the objects. I said, okay, FYI, these items are very, very, very fragile and precious. I ask you that you all please, please, please treat these items with caution and respect. And I do walk around. I don't just let them loose and like hide behind the podium. I do walk around not only in case they have questions, but just to make sure that they're handling the materials properly. And they are. They were good students. They knew what they were doing.
So you've done one class where you gave them scans and then one class where you let them handle the actual archival materials. Do you have a preference as to which way to do that going forward, or is it really depending on the materials in the class?
Depending on the materials. I would love for them to have the item in their hands, but again, it just comes to the classes are being too big for the one item, and some just might be too fragile and will fall apart instantly into dust if you touch it. So yeah, again, depending on how fragile the item is, I'll go towards digitization. But if they're sturdy enough, then I'll say, okay, you can touch these, just be careful.
Does Chaffey College have any online classes?
We do, yes. We are, I think most of our classes are online, although we're trying to push a little bit more in person. And yeah, enrollment in person has gone up as well. But I think we are pretty much equally now divided between online and in-person classes.
So are any of these classes online classes that you got coming up, or is it mostly in person?
No, they're mostly in person. Sometimes they're hybrid, but for the most part, they are on-campus classes.
All right, I'm checking the chat. All right. And this is one of my questions. Um, has these experiences with these classes kind of changed your collection development policy? So, for example, now that you know there's an interest in Mexican migrant workers, do you have like an eye out for items to collect?
No, because our collection development in terms of archives, like I said, it's really focusing on the college. Not so much the local history, even though we happen to have some items reflecting that, but they lean more on the secondary source side. So a lot of books, magazine articles, even journal articles. For stuff like that for local history, I tend to refer people to their local library. So Upland Library, Ontario Public Library tends
Mm.
to be a little bit more strong in that. And if people do try to donate items like that to us. I had to turn down this one. He had a huge Southern California collection. It was mostly secondary sources. Like, oh, we don't have the space, but and it doesn't fit our scope. So, but here you can go to Ontario or to Upland. They're more likely and probably more interested in taking your collection.
I think every archivist I know lack of space is a big issue. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
the size of ours, I would say it's the size of a child's bedroom when you go to those new housing developments that built like they're on top of each other. It's basically the size of a small child's bedroom.
wow. Are there any other questions in the chat? All right, this is my last question.
Okay.
How are you keeping statistics on the number of classes, the number of students, and all of that?
We do have a form that our library creator has created. I think it's on LibWizard.
Mhm.
So we go in after every class that we have and we type in, oh, this is this class. It was taught by this person. Here's the section number. Here's the amount of students I counted or that signed in. And that gets all rolled into LibWizard. And at the end of each term, we'll collect it all together and put it in for like our strategic reports. So that's how we keep track.
Great. We use LibWizards too. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. Last call to put your question in, or I think we're small enough you can unmute if you have a question. All right, I think that's it. Thank you for
Okay.
making time to spend with us, and we'll get this up, like I said, within a week, probably faster, but this was really great. So thank you,
Great.
Michelle.
Yeah, thank you.